Uh, let's move to our next and last but not least speaker, Professor Andy Miah. Professor Andy Miah is Chair of Science, Communication and Future Media at the University of Salford, Manchester, where is also the ethics champion for the Greater Manchester Artificial Intelligence Foundry. He is a frequent media commentator on emerging technologies, with a recent contribution for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the BBC. Some recent books include Drones and Sports 2.0, collaborations with global esports federations, the IOC and the British Esports Association, and quite recent lecture on the UN's ITU agency program, AI for Good. Professor Miah will present on a really interesting title, Evolutionary AI as a Crucial Design Principle for Future Sports. Professor Miah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And hopefully you can see me. I just got a bit of a frozen screen for me, but hopefully that's all working fine. It's great to be here, and it's especially nice when I have a chance to talk about some new ideas, and putting them together is often an exercise in intelligence in itself. And I hope to sort of take you on a journey over the next 20 minutes to speak to my own sort of experience of artificial intelligence, and perhaps also to answer this question as to whether AI will be the end of sports, because I think we sort of skirted around this issue a bit so far, but I'd love to sort of really hit it head on and decide and see where we end up. And I suppose I began my journey in AI about, 25 years ago, really, and it was studying philosophy. So a big part of my education was looking at the philosophy of mind, trying to make sense of how we are as a species, but also how biology exists and cognitively develops as well. So a big part of what interested me was the way in which technology is changing what it is to be human. And of course, Philippe at the opening section there talked very much about sport. And I think sport has always been sort of inherently a technological interface. And many of the early philosophers in this world talked about technology as an environment, which I think is an interesting way of sort of raising the starting point for technology as being something other than ourselves, outside of ourselves, as being the determining factor as to where technology begins. Because of course it's everywhere. From the moment we sort of start to use tools and employ them to serve our own ends, we begin that journey in technologizing the world around us. So it's quite a deep philosophical discussion as to where we end and when technology begins. In fact, many people working in genetics will talk about epigenetics, the phenomena that happen beyond our own genome, as being part of that environmental system that we can define as technology. A big part of where we are with genetic science today is understanding our own DNA is just one component of the range of bacterial formations that determine who we are and what kind of health prospects we face. It's not just about our genome, it's about the range of genomes that we host as well. So our fundamental beliefs about what it is to be not just human, but biology have gone under a huge amount of scrutiny and interrogation over the last 20 years, certainly since the beginnings of the Human Genome Project, but perhaps arguably in the 1950s, where we saw both the emergence of AI as a discipline, but also the emergence of genetics. So these fundamental shifts in how we think about the world around us. And it was that period that really influenced my own sort of beginnings in this area. So starting with, of course, a scientist that worked in my city of Manchester, where I work at University of Salford, Alan Turing, who came up with, of course, the famous Turing test, or the imitation game as it's known more formally, which was a way of trying to ascertain whether in fact we could determine machines as having the kind of intelligence that we have as humans. And since the 1950s, we saw these integrated ways of thinking about intelligence as not just something that only humans have, but also, of course, animals, but potentially non-biological forms such as computers. but it's an inherently controversial subject, not least because our own definition of intelligence has changed over time. So when we begin to answer this question about whether AI would be the end of sports, we have to first unpack this concept of AI, which has so many different definitions in the world of sports, as well as outside of it, that I think we need to distinguish them. And it's partly useful to do that because there are very different interpretations as to what this means for humanity. So we often think about AI as being the beginning of the end of humanity, that our jobs will be replaced by machines, that somehow aspects of who we are and our value is undermined by these technologies. And I think, much like Philippe talking about the integration of technology within sports, when we begin to think of it as inherently a technological relationship, then it gives us cause for some degree of optimism about where this may go. And certainly many people in this world both are optimistic about the prospects of AI making a fruitful contribution to humanity. But of course, we also know that technology has transformed humans in all sorts of ways. And certainly there are varying estimations as to what kinds of job prospects we may have in the future and how many of these roles may be taken by machines. But I tend to think it's a useful way to start by considering that everything that we do will change as a result of technological interference, as I would describe it. So I am a teacher. I teach at universities. I'm quite comfortable with the idea that in fact teaching itself will become a very different proposition 20 years from now. I would hope that teachers still have a role, but it's of course clear that technology is changing the nature of that role, and we begin to see that especially over the last 15 months of the COVID pandemic, where we've had to really evolve our own practice as teachers to accommodate the fact that everything's being delivered online and remotely. So this renegotiation of parameters that occurs around technological interference is, I think, a healthy way to think about the future. And it was really one of the early interventions of AI researchers that shaped my interest in this subject, which was the very famous and often cited chess competition between IBM's Deep Blue machine and Garry Kasparov, which is wonderfully immortalized within the documentary titled Game Over, which I think is a lovely sort of connection also with Mehdi's talk, and I'll come back to esports a bit later. But within this film, where Kasparov revisits this experience where he was beaten by the machine, and it was this moment of imagining a future where machines were taking over humanity and perhaps bringing about their demise, he talked about the idea that there was some kind of ghost in the machine, that there was a humanity present within it, which I think is now sort of evidenced by the fact that there were grandmasters very much influencing the development of IBM's machine overnight, certainly to reprogram it, to upskill it. And actually that methodology is quite a compelling methodology within AI research now. So we distinguish between different forms of AI, and whilst we have a kind of general sense of artificial intelligence as being machinic intelligence in some format, that term very much, as Mehdi also sort of alluded to, has been broken down into a range of sort of more specialized and specific definitions to characterize different ways in which machines are now programmed. So if we think about AI as being this collection of technologies that is trying to operationalize rule-based systems and then apply them automatically so that the machine can operate autonomously, that is, I would say, the sort of weak AI definition we would talk about 20 years ago, where we describe this phenomenon where we're trying to simply get machines to do the things that they're programmed to do, whether it's a robotic arm trying to construct a vehicle or a computer program. These are what we call sort of quite superficial forms of AI. On a deeper level, we get into what is now, I would say, the mainstay of AI, which is machine learning, which has been alluded to within the game sort of constructions we've seen around esports earlier. But again, it's sort of taking quite fundamental principles of learning and inputting them into machines to hopefully allow them to develop more sophisticated algorithms themselves. So the way to sort of think about it is that machine learning is trying to give a machine some principles, and it then deduces what it needs to do next and hopefully become better. So a simple way to think about it might be Netflix. So Netflix will study your data, your consumption within the platform, and then try to recommend films that you might like based on your previous behavior. So this would be a quite rudimentary system of machine learning. And if you're like me and it's not terribly intelligent because it often gets it terribly wrong and doesn't feel like it really understands me as a person yet. But it's a good example because it also shows us that the complexity of machine learning is still not quite where it needs to be to understand, what it is to actually watch a film or play a game. But nevertheless, it's a good sort of principle. Where we get into the next level is around deep learning. So this is really trying to realize techniques that can allow machine learning to be more effective. So rather than give machines principles that they then follow rules and then create a form of intelligence, deep learning is trying to allow the machine to establish those principles for itself. So to have some initial sort of rule-based principles, and then it goes on and develops and learns accordingly. So deciphering rules is a big part of this. So one way of thinking about that might be to consider the way in which an artificially intelligent system would create sign language, which has actually been in the news over the last couple of weeks. So using complex image recognition, the AI program would be looking for features, a number of features, and try to essentially put them together in patterns that make sense before making a judgment as to whether it's correct or not. So we're moving into a period where AI is not just applying rules, as in the general sense of weak AI, but not just also applying principles it's been programmed to create and learn from them, but actually establishing the parameters of learning for itself. And that is, I think, what's really exciting about AI at the moment, and where a lot of researchers are trying to focus. And in order to do that, we have to have a deeper sense of what intelligence is. So a big journey that has been taking place over the last 50 years is moving away from the idea that intelligence is something that's unique to humanity. So a lot of the early work in AI was trying to see how we could replicate human intelligence, as if the measure of intelligence is in fact the human species. And many researchers now reject that model, that in fact human intelligence is not necessarily the pinnacle of biological intelligence. It's one format of intelligence that's been allowed to flourish as a result of a range of environmental conditions. But there are, of course, forms of intelligence that other non-human biological life forms have that we don't have as a species. So things like contextuality, being able to understand our surroundings in a very complex way. Episodic memory is also another example of that sort of complexity. But so again, to sort of start things off with the conversation is to unpack that definition of intelligence, and to believe really that in fact this journey is still not over. So we don't fully realize what artificial intelligence can be yet. We're still very much early on in that process. So to conclude that AI would be the end of sports, I think is premature, because AI is still very much in its infancy. And many people who work, as you sort of hear in some of the conversations we've had already, a lot of what we're talking about is data-driven science. So having a huge amount of data that we can then funnel into a system to build, hopefully, greater solutions that can give insights into a whole number of things. And there are a number of critical sort of AI researchers that would describe where we are as essentially similar to where we were with Deep Blue, where we're still trying to get as much data as possible to then make the system more complex and more capable of learning. So how does this relate to sports? And I wanted to broaden it out a little bit further before coming back to esports, because I think there is so much already that is taking place in the world of sport that is informed by, underpinned by, but also very much reliant on AI as a way of enhancing the sporting experience. And I think the concern that we have about AI is that somehow it would be to the absence or the erosion of human judgment or human presence, perhaps, which I think I think that's a mistake. I think, in fact, it's likely to push humanity further into modifying our practices to make them richer, more complex, more engaging, and more challenging too. And let's remember that whereas in 1997, IBM's Deep Blue played Garry Kasparov in the game of chess, it was in 2019 that the latest iteration of that competition took place between IBM's Alpha Star program and StarCraft, the esports title. So our challenge associated with AI constantly evolves. And it's interesting, I think, that we see the esports world at the heart of that development. I think the proposition is that the complexity of StarCraft as a game is a really big intelligence challenge. So if a computer can beat a human at StarCraft, well, it must be even more intelligent than if it was playing chess. So AI is pushing humanity further in trying to think about its position and role and the sorts of things that we do, the sorts of games that we play. But I think there are certainly sort of 4 areas where we can see AI already having a big impact on sports. So from the regulatory side, we can see how AI is being used in officiating, refereeing. And again, there've been lively discussions about whether that's good or bad for sports, but certainly in many sports, that's already accepted as a useful thing to hopefully make decisions more accurate, make results more truthful. And I think that aspect of it has allowed then referees to focus on orchestrating the kind of ambience of the playing field as a kind of conductor almost, rather than someone that is having to just see whether a ball's crossed over a line. It's also clear that we've seen AI being used in sports to help with things like match fixing, to identify forms of corruption. Again, this is pattern recognition, trying to explore whether behaviors in consumption or online activity can be some indicator of dubious practices. And we see this also emerging in the world of doping practices as well, whether we can use data to help us identify troublesome behaviors. We've also seen AI being used in performance, much like the way Mehdi was talking about in the context of esports. We see a whole range of AI platforms being used to identify not just actually whether players are performance feedback to help them improve their performances, but also monitoring of health and injury risk possibilities. So using, again, powerful data systems that allow us to gain greater insights into whether an athlete may be approaching a degree of risk. We've also seen AI being used to orchestrate decision-making in sports too. So we know that with FIFA, the computer game FIFA, we've seen the data modeling being used in the playing of games by citizens being used as a way of informing decisions within clubs. And of course, it makes sense because if you're a football club, you only have a small number of matches where you can see how the scenario is going to play out. But if you have hundreds of thousands of amateur players using the quite near reality of the FIFA game to see what happens within a particular configuration, this can be really powerful to help you make decisions as a manager too. It can also potentially democratize decision making. So AI could allow a club to be managed entirely by the collective hive mind of the spectators, which I think is something we might see down the road as well. And then, of course, we also see the beginnings of optimized advertising and broadcast models, so intelligent systems where we can create a televisual feed that isn't reliant wholly on individual camera operators, but where there's a configuration of cameras that are managed centrally by a system that's trying to get the best out of the footage. So all of those industries that operate around sports are now being influenced and informed by principles in AI. And this is becoming all the more exciting in the world of esports, where we see the possibility, partly because of the fact that the playing field of esports is, of course, a computer generated playing field. So we can now render these experiences within 3D models that allow us then to occupy the playing field in quite radical ways. So there's already systems to try to create virtual reality spectator environments where you can put on a headset and then be within the field of play to experience the game as it's taking place. We've also seen a lot of games being designed through AI as well. So AI can improve the gameplay within the computer game itself. And I think that's an interesting thing to consider when we reflect on also the traditional sport forms. We think about sports as being relatively stable entities, but of course they've changed their rules over the years, and AI may provide ways and insights to make sports optimized more effectively. And I watched the Eurovision over the weekend here in the UK, much to our disappointment, of course, we ending up with nil points, but nevertheless, the way in which they have created a system of suspense and excitement in the conclusion of the event is an interesting way in which their scoring system has evolved over time. So it's clear that we can reconfigure the rules of sports to make them more exciting, to respond to the attention interests of consumers. And I think we've seen lots of innovation in that aspect too. And games, of course, can use AI to test the playability of the experience as well, I think. And so we can see that AI is becoming central to the production of sports. And I think the step we're moving into is where we can also use AI to evolve sports as well, to move them into even more compelling, complex, challenging experiences that respond to the fact that we're now deeply embedded within digital worlds, and the integration of physical and digital is even more important. So to bring this to a conclusion, really, to have enough time for us to have a conversation about this, I would say that far from being the end of sports, I think that the future of sports is very much reliant on and enriched by the fact that AI is around. It will push humanity to challenge itself further, and I look forward to seeing where that goes. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy, for this very optimistic last word on sport. That's really interesting. Really interesting point that you've raised about the fact that AI is helping us to actually question ourselves and what it is to be a human. That's really interesting, definitely. And especially because, as you mentioned it, there is a lack of clear definition of a lot of words that are used in the AI field. Thank you for all that. Thank you for the insightful presentation. I will now give